In the fall of 2017, I began compiling a statistical analysis of Dreamcast games that ultimately resulted in 2 videos that launched my YouTube channel. As part of that analysis, I looked at Dreamcast game prices on eBay. And now, a year later, I'm returning to that dataset to update the numbers so that we can see the value fluctuations in the Dreamcast game market over the last year. This is part 3 of a 3-part Dreamcast video series on this topic. In this video, I'm going to step away from the micro focus of parts 1 and 2 and instead look at the Dreamcast market from a macro level, the big picture. First up, let's take a look at the overall Dreamcast game library and see how many games are increasing, decreasing, and staying the same in terms of value. Roughly 11% of games, 27 of them, stayed about the same in value from the fall of 2017 to fall 2018. Another 19% went down in value, meaning that a massive 70% or 174 Dreamcast games increased in price. This is no doubt a rising library. And let's start to put some actual numbers on that library. In the fall of 2017, if you owned a complete collection of USA Dreamcast releases, you could expect, on average, to have a game library worth a little over $4,900 for complete in-box games. A year later, in the fall of 2018, you could expect that library to be worth a little over $5,500. Just about a $600 increase in overall value over the course of a year. Now, not that I would ever, and I mean ever, suggest looking at retro video games as an investment vehicle, but just because I know some people will wonder, hell, I wondered it, how the Dreamcast library compares to other investments. And of course, when we think about other investments, we inevitably think about Wall Street, stocks, bonds, mutual funds. And probably the #1 representation of overall stocks is the S&P 500 Index Fund. A fund that saw around 16% growth over the same time period as this Dreamcast analysis. So 16% return versus 12%, your money would have been better off parked in the 500 Index Fund during this time period. But again, please don't get into retro games as an investment. This whole video is meant to be for fun and general information, not an investment guide. In terms of average game prices on the used market, in the fall of 2017, the average Dreamcast game sold for $19.93. A year later, that average had increased to $22.41. And statistically speaking, these differences in means are significant, meaning that this difference can't just be attributed to mere chance. But I don't really like talking about averages because the wild outliers like Cannon Spike and GigaWing 2 tend to do crazy things to that average. It's a lot like looking at average household income when you have guys like Bill Gates in the mix. So for this reason, the median value, the middle value, is often a better measure. And in the case of the Dreamcast, the median game sold for $13 in the fall of 2017 and $15 in the fall of 2018. So quite a bit less than the average, but it's definitely still on the rise. And talking about outliers like Cannon Spike, let's look at the overall distribution of game values across the 2 years. First, let's reveal the distribution of prices in the fall of 2017. Now that same distribution in the fall of 2018. The first thing you'll notice is that the fall of 2018 data is pushed further to the right, meaning that prices in 2018 have increased overall. Now these 2 boxes and their extending lines are the most important part of the graphic. That's where the majority of the data sits. In fact, these areas represent data for more than 90% of the games, so we'll come back to those in a moment. But first, these dots out here are individual games that are outliers. Each dot is a game that's marked much higher than the majority of the rest of the games. They're the extremes, the Bill Gateses of the retro market. But let's look at this data independent of those outliers for a moment. So let's zoom in on these boxes and their extending lines that represent more than 90% of the games in each year. The shaded box for 2017 tells us graphically that 50% of Dreamcast games that year were valued between $8 and $24, with the median game, that line there, selling for $13. And in 2018, 50% of Dreamcast games were valued between $10 and $26, with the median game selling for $15. You'll also notice the extending lines from these boxes. These areas represent the lower and upper 25% of games minus the outliers. You can see in 2018, the upper range extends further than it did in 2017. Now that we have the basics out of the way, let's look at how prices change by various categories. And let's start by looking at price changes according to original sales levels, because this is basic economics. Those games that sold very few copies in the Dreamcast's original lifespan of 99 to 2002 should now have fewer copies available in the wild in 2018, and therefore sell for higher prices than games that sold a lot of copies in 99 to 2002. And this graphic shows us the average percent change in prices over the last year according to various buckets of original sales levels. As this unfolds, do you see anything interesting? Because I definitely do. Those games that originally sold fewer than 15,000 copies in 99 to 2002, the lowest category of sales, they increased on average by just 10% in value from the fall of 2017 to the fall of 2018. But on the other end of the spectrum, those games that sold in the highest category of sales, selling more than 100,000 copies originally, they increased in price by nearly double that percentage over the last year. But this is where you have to use some critical thinking. I believe that the games in the lowest original sales category may have seen the smallest price increases recently because those games were already priced very highly in the used games market. In other words, the market has already spoken on those games. Their scarcity has already been factored into the price. Whereas the remainder of the library, well, maybe the market is still adjusting to account for those prices. What do you think? And next, how about price changes by genre? Are some genres increasing more than others? The answer is yes. Here are the average percent price increases over the last year when sorted by genre. It's RPGs that gained the least ground in price, while sports and driving games both saw big average price increases. But again, this could be down to the market having already spoken on the RPG and fighting genres, while it's still trying to figure out the right prices for sports and driving games. And that's without mentioning that the average sports game sold for just $9 in 2018. So any movement in that price is going to represent an overly large percentage change relative to other genres. In fact, let's switch this graph from percent changes to actual dollar changes and see how it looks. Now you can see that sports games, although they had the second biggest percent increase, actually had the third lowest dollar change. And it was action games, driving games, and fighting games that had fairly large average dollar increases. Still, the percent differences are statistically significant, meaning there's probably something going on there beyond just mere chance. Now on to one of my favorite topics, looking at differences in price increases by game publisher. If you watched part 1 of this trilogy, you might be surprised to see the average Capcom game only increased by 15% over the last year. And I say surprised because Capcom had 5 games on that top 10 list of biggest price increases. But overall, those games didn't increase much relative to some other publishers. Let's stop here for a moment and create a little drama. The number 2 publisher in terms of price increase was Sega, and number 1, it was Activision. Games from both of those publishers basically increased by a quarter over the last year. So what about Dreamcast exclusives? I compiled a list of Dreamcast games that have remained more or less console exclusive to the Dreamcast. And logically, I would expect that those games would see bigger price increases than non-exclusives. I mean, that makes sense, does it not? It's another way to constrain supply. Back to basic economics. Well, non-exclusives increased on average by around 21% in price over the last year. And those exclusive games, they saw just an average increase of 17%. So what's going on? Again, I think that the market probably has already spoken, and the prices on the exclusives are probably already up high, and it's harder for them to gain value, at least percentage-wise. Or it could just be the wacky world of retro video games, forever puzzling and confusing us. Let's explore one more category just for fun before we take a look at the biggest individual outliers. How about price increase differences between those games that are actually good and fun to play versus those that maybe aren't so good? And we can operationalize this by splitting games into 2 categories. Those that IGN scored less than 8 and those that they scored higher than 8. And I'm not saying that IGN is the be-all end-all authority on quality, but it is a data point that I already have, and I think it's more or less pretty accurate overall. Now those games that IGN scored less than 8, they increased in price by nearly 25% in value over the last year. And you know what that means. Those that IGN scored higher than 8, they only increased by 16% on average. So just because a game is subjectively bad, doesn't mean that it can't increase in price. and by pretty substantial amounts. I mean, check this out. Here are just a few of the games that had awful review scores, but had fairly significant price increases from fall of 2017 to fall of 2018. I mean, look at this. Chicken Run? Really? Again, things get so wacky when you enter the retro gaming world. The great thing about running your own YouTube channel is that you can break your own rules. I said this was a macro video, but I'm actually going to finish by doing some micro-level analysis. I want to look at those big names in the Dreamcast library, the 10 biggest outliers in terms of value, and see how they behaved over the last year. So with this list, we're looking at those 10 most expensive games on the system in 2018, along with each game's price in the fall of 2017, the dollar change between the years, the percent change, and finally the game's position change between the 2 years. And so as this graphic unfolds, some things immediately jump out, at least to me. First, JoJo's Bizarre Adventure jumped 5 spots from number 13 to number 8. Increasing by nearly 45% in price. It's one of just 2 games that weren't on the top 10 list in 2017. Next, we have Gigawing, Power Stone 2, and Gunbird 2, which all fell 2 spots from their 2017 position. Then we have Resident Evil 2, a game we covered in part 1 of this trilogy. A huge 60% increase, taking the game from the number 16 spot in 2017 all the way up to number 5 in 2018. The only other game to crack the top 10 after missing it in 2017. And at the very tippy top of the list, the top 4 games remained unchanged in position from fall of 2017 to 2018. But notice that Cannon Spike is the only game in the top 10 that actually saw a price decrease, dropping 8%, while Mars Matrix shot up 30+%. It's going to be interesting to see if Mars Matrix continues to increase while Gigawing 2 and Cannon Spike seemingly plateau. So that's it. The trilogy is complete. If you missed either of the first 2 entries and you like top 10 lists, I recommend you check them out. I mean, of course I'd recommend that. And if you've watched all 3 videos, thank you so much for your time. And until next time, all the best and the sky is the limit.